Okay, I'm here with John Husband, who is a management consultant, a sociologist, and an anthropologist who has been examining how our world has been changing. Let me start over. I'm here with John Husband, who has worked as a management consultant and is a sociologist and anthropologist who has been observing and chronicling the individual and collective mutations of the emerging network world. He's the author of Wirearchy, Sketches for the Future of Work, and the co-author of The Emergent Society of the 21st Century and Making Knowledge Work, The Arrival of Web 2.0. And we've been talking about John's concept of wirearchy, which is his analysis of how we're changing as a network society, his thoughts on how blockchain plays into that, and we're gonna get into a great conversation about how blockchain is changing our world at the sociological level. So John, thank you very much for doing this interview with me.
Thanks very much for the opportunity, and it's good to be at one of the many, I think these kinds of things happen around the world monthly in different cities, one of the many hackathons, gatherings, conversations, happenings where people are getting together not only with respect to the blockchain, but with respect to maker fairs, fab labs, living labs, fail camps, all of the kinds of activities that have been spawned and accompanied our planet's ongoing march through the emergence of a networked, hyperlinked world that is made visible to us on screens. What the collective capabilities and dynamics that have developed over the last 20 years since the graphical user interface developed and started to make browsing the web and using the web easier for people has gathered in speed, force of impact, breadth of impact, depth of impact, and I'm often, when I'm doing presentations or workshops, saying only half glibly that we're going to see a lot more change over the next 10 years than we have seen in the last 10 years, and most people today are beginning to reel and become anxious differently than they used to encounter anxiety because of some of the really significant changes that even the last 10 years have brought. We've moved very, very quickly from reading to much shorter attention spans, taking information in on images and screens, which goes much more quickly to the processing by our amygdala, the limbic brain, and so we find ourselves reacting to and with emotions and making decisions differently than we used to. And some of the kinds of things that are happening represent very, very drastic changes to what we understand as human social, cultural, and economic activity. And I start a number of my presentations these days with, well, you may have been hoping that these conditions are going to go away or smoothen out, but they're not going to go away, and it's going to get bumpier.
Okay, so, wow, so when you say that there's going to be more change in the next 10 years than the last 10 years, and you're looking at this not just from the perspective of technology, obviously at these kind of hackathons and makerspaces, people are promoting their next big thing, their ICO or their startup or whatever great technological solution they're going to bring, but very few people take a step back and say, okay, well, what is this going to do to us as a society? And as you've touched on, the last 10 years have prompted drastic changes. I think, as you mentioned, not just in how we organize sociologically, but in our brains, how our brains process information, how we interface with the world. Maybe you can touch on some of the changes that you see coming sociologically over the next 10 years, maybe particularly with blockchain.
Yeah, I'd like to do that, and it's something that I'm passionate about, of course, because I originated the term wirearchy. I'll explain that in a minute. And I also feel as if I'm cursed by having originated that term, because The term came about 18 years ago. One day in the shower, I just popped into my head because we had started reading and hearing about living in a wired world. And I had come from 15 or 20 years of helping large organizations design, build, and implement their hierarchies, the org charts, the salary scales, all of the different protocols for managing organized human activities. And the things that informed what I was doing back then were all of the things that we lump together in the classic term management science. You know, division of labor, specialization, efficiency seeking, avoiding redundancies, and so on. So everything that was built to be in the terms of Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework, complicated situations, whereas the hyperlinked networked flows of information that are now part of our daily life are taking many businesses, many organizations, many government services, many groups of people, and many individuals into confrontations with what are called complex conditions, complexity as opposed to complicatedness.
Maybe you can say a bit more about what that is.
Yeah, sure,
okay.
I'm going to.
Okay.
But I want to come back to the term wirearchy, because when I started talking and writing about it, with the knowledge, fairly deep knowledge as a practitioner of what are the rules and protocols for traditional hierarchies, I met with a lot of ridicule, puzzled question marks. What exactly are you talking about? Sounds kind of futuristic and pretty abstract. And I've also then, over the last 18 years, and with gathering speed, it has become a term that's relatively widely used, and many people have heard of it. I've got some very interesting stories about absolutely random meetings of people on different parts of the planet who have heard of the concept. But let me be a bit more specific. We, at the apogee of the world driven by management science, where most organizations are informed on their strategy and structure with the help of classical management consultancy firms, was built on assessment, evaluation, and analysis, and evolution of thinking during the last chapters of the industrial era. These ideas generally did not foresee hyperlinks, networks, connected flows of information. We're now 15 to 20 years into that. Let's say 15 years, because Web 2.0, if you will, the interactive web, was born around 2000, 2001. And this new form of activity that is spread around the planet and that most people are using all day long on their smartphones and at work behind their screens and so on, is eroding bit by bit, pun intended, the traditional pillars, the solid pillars of traditional classic hierarchy. We've heard a lot about people working together in collaboration. Most organizations have spent the last 5 years installing, implementing, and trying to get people to use collaborative platforms. What tends to get in the way of easy adoption, notwithstanding 20, 30, 40 years of people saying, the value and the ideas and the effective responses are in your workers' minds and hearts, that we have an awful lot of people, I think, in many organizations that are working away under an umbrella of learned helplessness because we've become accustomed by an industrial era school system, education system, credentialing system, job seeking, job design, organizational design paradigm that relies on, or had relied on, workers following instructions, and the instructions came from on high. So wirearchy is an evolution, I would say, of hierarchy in a networked world, in the sense that humans many humans, most humans, myself included, need some forms of hierarchy in some types of activities, whether they're a hierarchy of needs for your individual self or a hierarchy of decision making for a given kind of group. At the same time, there's an awful lot of historical principle and exploration of self-directed groups, self-managed tasks, taking of responsibility, acting, and so on. To wirearchy, the working definition that was created about 18 years ago is a dynamic two-way flow of power and authority based on knowledge, trust, credibility, and a focus on results, enabled by interconnected people and technology. Now, many people, because it's kind of a catchy word, have asked me, well, how do you do it, or what's the approach? And I consistently refuse really to answer that question other than by saying it's a principle, not a method. And so every different context, different organization, different set of challenges that you meet will have its own way of configuring activities. There are patterns that are now emerging from, and it could be different based on the industry, the nature of work, and so on. But there are various patterns that have been emerging and that have been pretty well explored in the areas of social and organizational network analysis, for example, and certainly in the peer-to-peer ecosystems, the commonings movements around the world, the open source movement, and the various citizen participation movements and initiatives that are happening all around the world. We are seeing a gradual raising of awareness of the lessened legitimacy of traditional hierarchical power structures and decision making. Many of the Western world's governments are losing legitimacy, and people are facing a set of complex conditions that is coming at them faster than they know how to adapt. This is why I say that the next 10 years are going to be more changeful and more interesting, because we have coming at us still artificial intelligence, algorithms, predictive analytics, Internet of Things, blockchain, and so on. These things are not going to go away. They're going to try to be managed, corralled, and controlled, probably by governments, and various governments with varying degrees of democracy will do different things. For example, China rules what happens on the internet in its borders much differently than is the case in Western Europe and North America. However, long term, we're now at a stage where children that have been born since 10 years ago will never know a world without computers, without screens, without touch screens, without clicking, and so on. In understanding that, I'm starting to pay attention to some of the extremely important human concepts, beliefs, and activities that we are losing touch with, that are fading in the rearview mirror of history very quickly.
Fascinating. So the future is rushing to meet us faster than anyone perhaps can catch up with. How do you see, when you're talking about wirearchy and these changing hierarchies, obviously the big key with blockchain is decentralization and the potential to decentralize power for various things around the planet. Mm-hmm. How do you see blockchain itself working into what we're facing?
Well, one of the things that I think is important to understand, and I don't know if I'm right or not. Most of what I talk about, I'm not really sure I'm right. I think I have an informed opinion. Is that decentralization of activities to focus on a particular service or to serve a particular ecosystem of stakeholders or some such, pretty much always demands the taking of more responsibility to engage individually somehow. And the reason I say that is I mentioned it a few minutes ago. In traditional hierarchy, And I'm thinking of a movie that's about 10 or 15 years old now called Pleasantville, where the world goes from black and white to color as people find their voice, speak out, and express who they are, become expressions of their own names, if you will. Is that an enormous number of people, given our socioeconomic setup, go to school so that they can get a job. Better school, better job. Better job, better pay. But then as you move in through your 20s into your 30s, many people, and much differently today than even 20 or 30 years ago, begin families, acquire a house, acquire a mortgage, get a car, get a job, and work away at it, which is okay usually in the late 20s and early 30s. We're eager, we're bright, we want to create a good life and so on. And I'm now thinking of a master's degree in coaching I took about 20 years ago, where it's about earliest stage, mid-30s, 40, 45, that you start understanding that life presents you with really messy, wicked challenges. And at the same time, you've got all of these obligations. You're tied by your mortgage, your kids' school fees, your car lease fees, and so on. And there's a bit of an epidemic of people wanting to break free, but having to continue meeting on, not a bit of an epidemic, a lot of people are wondering about, how do I live differently? How do I work differently? And so on. I'm a bit unusual, I suppose, in that I went through that kind of thinking in my 40s, and I very abruptly quit a very senior position in management consulting, and transitioned to nothing. I didn't know who I was or what I was going to do for a few years. I just knew that I did not want to, for the next 20 years, help keep reinforcing and installing traditional hierarchies, because I was reading a lot about the information age and what was coming at us. And so, because I didn't have another job, because I didn't identify something to do, what I decided to do was start relatively radically simplifying my life so that I wouldn't have to depend on continued employment, so that I wouldn't have to kowtow to or accept to work on things I didn't believe in, didn't want to, and so on. But I'm now about 10 to 15 years into that, and have also been living through, the advent of wikis, blogs, connectedness, conversations, Twitter, Facebook, and on and on. And what I believe I'm seeing now, and I'm pretty sure, is that life is becoming more fluid for everyone and for everything. And that will become one of the key interesting points of the application of blockchain architecture and capacities to different kinds of human activities, because the decentralization will demand the engagement, the understanding, and the critical thinking of people who are deciding to use these services. A lot of it will depend on UX design and so on. And the centralization aspects of it will demand that, and this is getting into the government's parts, that the centralization is legitimate, is perceived to be legitimate by people who are using blockchain services, and that it provides some value by that centralization, whether it's governance value, whether it's some kind of control marker or gate that people can use to reflect to see, is this addressing what this particular architecture and capacities was intended to address? How is it evolving? Do we need to fork it in one way or another? And so on. But all of this demands a better, deeper, broader understanding of what is digital, what are hyperlinks, what is a platform, why blockchain architecture and the way blockchain functions provides that trust and credibility that are the middle parts of the definition of wirearchy. What infuses the trust and credibility are well-designed smart contracts that contain the framework for addressing a certain kind of knowledge. Let's say the knowledge of who's the owner of a house and we're transferring title and so on. And the security and encrypted aspects address the trust and credibility. And the last part of the definition of wirearchy is the focus on results, which means when you carry this out, it's a done deal. It's a transaction that's been carried out between two parties, peer to peer, based on trust, credibility with the pertinent knowledge. So for me, what I presume will be the architecture and the capabilities and the dynamics of blockchain platforms and services fits